Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. I hope you guys had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Thank you so much for giving me a little grace, taking a break with me. I hope your weekend was full of fun and maybe some relaxation, which was totally the theme of my weekend, and maybe spent some time with family and friends. We're back, though, here on Legal Tea, and today we are on the celebrity estate planning topic. And for today's episode, we are going to dive into what happened following the death of Kasem, who is the voice of Shaggy on Scooby-Doo shows and movies. I think I accidentally said at the end of my last episode that Casey was the voice of Scooby. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. If I did, that was my mistake. In my head, I had Shaggy, but I think I slipped up and maybe said Scooby. So, to confirm, Kasem was the famous Shaggy voice. You know, Shaggy, the sidekick, the owner of Scooby-Doo the dog. What a classic, right? Oh my goodness, and I loved those shows and movies as well, so it's an honor to do this episode. So today's episode is going to be on what happened following the death of Kasem. But before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about Casey's life to understand who and what was near and dear to him. According to his Wikipedia page, hailing from Detroit, Michigan, Casey was born in April 1932. He did some radio sports broadcasting as a young adult for a high school in Detroit. Then years later, he started doing professional broadcasting in Flint, Michigan. Though, due to his family needing his hands and help at their family grocery store, he stopped doing broadcasting kind of temporarily. I think Wikipedia says it best. Kasem's voice was the key to his career. That's a perfect way to say it. Fast forward years, in 1969 specifically, that's when he started his career doing the voice for Shaggy on Scooby-Doo. Now, he was not only the original voice of Shaggy, but he was also the longest-serving voice of Shaggy as well. So to clarify, over time there were others that served as Shaggy's voice, but Casey was the original and the longest. Casey voiced Shaggy from 1969 to 1997, and again from 2002 to 2009. So he did it a long time for sure. The following year, in 1970, Casey, along with a few other people named Don Bustani, Tom Rounds, and Ron Jacobs, they started the weekly radio program America Top 40. This show ended up going nationwide and became quite the hit. Now, a cool link between Scooby-Doo and America Top 40 was that at the end of Scooby-Doo, many will remember that Shaggy, aka Casey, ended the show with the saying, "Keep your feet on the ground and keep reaching for the stars." Well, he ended the America Top 40 program with that exact same line. Beyond Shaggy and America Top 40, he also voiced a lot more things as well. That if I tried to list them all, we may be here all day, so I'm not going to. So just know his name and his voice was associated with many other characters in shows and movies, and he even did some acting too. Personally speaking, Casey was married first to a lady named Linda Myers from 1972 until 1979. Together, they had 3 children, Mike, Julie, and Carrie. And kind of a cool fun fact, 2 of the kids, Mike and Carrie, ended up getting into radio broadcasting too. Shortly after Casey and Linda's divorce, Casey married actress Jean Thompson in 1980, and they were together until Casey's death. Together, Casey and Jean had 1 child named Liberty. Fast forward some time, specifically October 2013, Carrie, which is one of Casey's daughters from the first marriage, announced that Casey had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. But he had been actually diagnosed back in 2007. So her announcement came like 6 years after the real diagnosis. But then shortly after the announcement, Carrie also shared that Casey had Lewy body dementia. His final months left Casey unable to speak, which, since he was most known for his voice, is about the saddest thing ever. As his condition worsened, generally speaking, his wife Jean started putting up walls around Casey and, according to Wikipedia, quote, prevented any contact with Casey, particularly by his children from his first marriage, end quote. That, of course, went over like a lead balloon, and his kids from the first marriage, Mike, Julie, and Carrie, along with some of Casey's family members, friends, and colleagues, they actually protested outside Casey and Jean's house. And it got so bad that the kids from his first marriage, Mike, Julie, and Carrie, attempted to become Casey's conservators or guardians over their father, though at that point the court did deny their request. The strangeness did not stop there. In May of 2014, Jean took Casey out of a nursing home that he was in at the time, and as a response, Carrie, one of Casey's daughters from the first marriage, once again sought conservatorship over Casey. This time, the judge granted Carrie a temporary conservatorship, and the court ordered that Jean disclose Casey's whereabouts. Well, he was located in the state of Washington in a hospital in critical but stable condition. At this point, the judge ordered that Casey's kids from his first marriage and Casey's current spouse, have separate, visitation rights to Casey. Though that sure didn't stop the drama, because after visiting Casey, Jean said that at her prior visit, she had learned that Casey had not been given food, water, or medication the prior weekend. Carrie, through her attorney, responded and said that she, quote, had him removed from artificial food and water on the orders of a doctor, and in accordance with a directive that Casey signed in 2007, saying he would not want to be kept alive if it would result in a mere biological existence devoid of cognitive function with no reasonable hope for normal functioning, end quote. So, after learning what was happening and what this directive said that was signed by Casey, the judge ordered that the family was allowed to put Casey on end-of-life measures. And of course, that was objected to by Jean, but that was denied. Then, on June 14th, 2004, Casey died at the age of 82. Would you believe me if I said that the drama did not stop there? Well, it didn't. And we're really actually just kind of getting started, unfortunately. After Casey's death, Jean was allowed to kind of deal with his body. And supposedly, Casey wanted to be buried. But not so fast, says the kids from the first marriage, because just over a month after Casey's death, Carrie sought and ended up successfully getting a temporary restraining order to stop Jean from cremating Casey's body. And that was because Carrie wanted an autopsy to be performed. Well, when Carrie marched her way to the funeral home with this temporary restraining order in hand, the funeral home shared that the body had been moved at the direction of Jean, and it was moved to another funeral home. This sounds like a total game of cat and mouse, right? So ultimately, after some back and forth, Casey was ultimately buried in Oslo, Norway on December 16th, 2014, which was 6 months after his death. Not a year after that, in November of 2015, the kids from Casey's first marriage, Mike, Julie, and Carrie, along with Casey's brother, sued Jean for wrongful death. And the lawsuit alleged that Jean committed elder abuse and inflicted emotional distress on them by not allowing them to see Casey before his passing. Jean and her daughter Liberty, that she shared with Casey, countersued them, claiming kind of similar arguments, honestly. In non-legal terms, they were basically pointing the finger at each other for the exact same thing. Though according to an article in USA Today, Jean also further alleged that the kids from the first marriage, quote, were motivated by their desire to get Casey's money after he cut them off financially in 2012, end quote. So, sadly, this drama definitely continued after Casey's death. His last years on this earth involved family fighting, and the family fighting continued years after his passing. And can you even imagine the legal fees through all of this? Man. According to that same article in USA Today, years later, specifically in 2019, both sides filed a joint pleading with the court to officially dismiss both sides' lawsuits. They shared in the pleading that they had come to terms on a settlement agreement, though the terms were not made public. However, among the more vocal ones post-settlement was Carrie, who said in a statement that she was distraught and heartbroken over her family and lawyer's decision to force her into a settlement. I find that to be a really interesting choice of words, forced into a settlement. I'd love to know more about what she meant by that. Through all of this, there are certainly a few lessons from an estate planning perspective that can be learned, right? Most notably, it's probably in regards to having these healthcare-related estate planning instruments actually in place. According to a blog written by Bridget Mackey, an estate attorney out of California, which of course the link to her blog is in the source links for this episode. According to that blog, Casey had healthcare directives prepared in 2007, remember? Well, those directives named Carrie, the daughter, as his healthcare agent, which is just a fancy term basically of who's making healthcare decisions. And he also did end-of-life documents stating what his wishes were regarding end-of-life measures. So as we talked about, ultimately the court ended up kind of listening, figuratively speaking, listening to Casey's documents by appointing Carrie as the temporary conservator. And then when they discovered he was at the end of his life and Carrie had begun withdrawing life-prolonging treatment, the court continued to listen to Casey's documented end-of-life wishes as well. So even though Jean objected to Carrie's appointment and Carrie's decisions, the court ultimately sided with Carrie, and likely mainly due to Casey having these documents in place. However, unfortunately, that did not necessarily prevent Carrie and Carrie and company, and Jean from duking it out, right? As this blog notes, quote, the lesson Casey failed to appreciate in this situation was the depth of distrust and animosity between his children and his wife, end quote. That is so true, and I have seen this play out in real life in my own practice before. No one really knows besides Casey and maybe the attorney who prepared these documents, his documents from 2007. No one really knows the reason he picked Carrie as his healthcare agent over Jean, but he did, period, end of story. And that sounds great and all, but I have to wonder if the war between Carrie and Jean could have been avoided, or at least somewhat lessened by just clear communication to all his kids and Jean, his spouse. Like the blog states, quote, he either should not have named Carrie as his agent or made it very clear to his wife and the other two children about what he wanted and why he was naming Carrie, even if it would cause distress with his wife, Jean, end quote. The question that pops into my head is, could clear communication completely have, solved this issue? We'll never know. We're only left with the cards we're dealt with now, but it's just something to kind of think about and consider. Would clear communication back then, while Casey was alive, could that have solved or lessened the issues that occurred, leading up to his death and post-death? Alrighty, I think we're ready to wrap this episode up. Next week, we are back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real-life clients, real-life cases that I or my office have worked on. And during that episode, we're going to be going over a story about a family that ended up fighting about who was going to be the executor. Which is interesting to me because so many people like to say that people fight over like money after someone dies, which they do, trust me. But this was not about the money, but instead who got to be in control. So we go into that story and we also talk about kind of qualifications that an executor has to have in order to serve. So tune in for that next week, my friends. And until then, take care and be well.